Yeah, reading.
Oh, that's good, isn't it? What's that to the picture? Oh, there it is. Oh, da, da, da. Could you pass the register around, please? Right. That's better. Right, boys and girls, nice to see you all. Actually, I say boys and girls, mostly girls, isn't it? So we've got a bit of an imbalanced gender mix in here. I wonder why that is. So I expect somebody's doing an IEI project on that, are they not? Nobody doing gender as part of your independent educational inquiry? Maybe a little bit? Okay, no, not at all. All right then. So today we're going to be looking at neuroscience and education. So you have, in the last few weeks, covered basic neuroanatomy. You've learned about some cellular mechanisms. You've learned about learning in terms of the brain. You've learned about how to think about the brain and the mind. And then we focused on some specific areas which may or may not be related to what you might be doing for your assignment. So we looked at literacy and reading, we looked at mathematics, and we looked at attention. And in a way, this is my last sort of plenary lecture to you all. It's my last chance to indoctrinate you. And therefore, I thought it would be fitting to think more broadly about the connections between neuroscience and education. Because not least because a lot of you are saying, oh, I really want to look at ADHD and what we know from neuroscience that I can apply in practice. And I'm having to say, no, just look at ADHD and what we know from neuroscience about ADHD. Because the applying in practice part is actually very difficult, and there are all sorts of issues with that. Tomorrow evening, we have a number of people, including me, who are leading these neuroscience and education projects around the country. So this is an event that's kicking off at 5:15 tomorrow evening. And I think it would be worth you attending if you're interested in what the applications are of neuroscience in education. It's partly an opportunity to talk to members of the public, but also there's going to be a lot of teachers there as well, I think, that we need to convince and have a discussion with, really, about their concerns and their hopes and how they see the opportunities in this area. So it's going to be quite an interesting discussion. I'm going to lead that off tomorrow evening with a talk about neuromyths, which is the basis of this paper that was published last month in Nature Neuroscience that caused all this social media stir. I'm doing that really as a way in to thinking about more positively the links between neuroscience and education. Neuromyths is something that people love talking about. It seems to be a very entertaining area. But actually, there's some serious messages in there about our serious attempts to bring together these two fields. So I thought I might try those slides out on you in a few minutes. There's only 10 of them, and see what you think, see if that's helpful to thinking about this area. So the next 2 weeks, we're going to have sort of working in groups. Now, I actually thought, and it's my fault, because I thought the deadline for the poster was today, but it's not, so don't panic. It's Friday, isn't it? Yes, okay. So, but the only trouble with that is that it gives me a little bit less time for me to sort out the groups, because I want to put all the people who are doing dyslexia together and all the people who are doing ADHD together. So that'll probably be circulated on Monday. And it really depends. It depends on who's doing what, but it's possible that you may only have to come in for one of the next 2 lectures. And when you do come in, you'll be sitting in a group of people who are studying pretty much the same area. That's the way it's supposed to work. So it'll feel more like a tutorial, really, in some respects. Okay. Yeah, and that's really to give you support in terms of developing your essay. I will try to get back some feedback to you as soon as possible about your poster. I think Sarah's likely to be helping me do that. Sarah's not here today. No, she's not. That'll be quite brief, like one or 2 sentences. But I guess the real discussion will be able to happen in those smaller group sessions that we have. Okay. So is there any questions before I carry on with that about what's going on? The basic structure of what's happening. So you're putting your poster in on Friday. You'll find out about which group you're in around Monday. You'll come in either that week or the next week for about an hour to talk in a smaller group about your essay. And then you'll be working on your essay over Christmas. I hope it doesn't spoil the mince pies. And then handing that in January. Okay. Good. Okay. Oh, yes, go on.
There's a deadline yet.
Is it not on?
It says. Oh, it is.
Oh, well, okay, what is it?
I think 16th.
16th January. Okay, there you go. Yeah, it means I've got lots of marking over my birthday, haven't I? Okay. So, let's move on to neuroscience and education. This is a very exciting new area. And of course, we have some people here who are studying nothing but this area for their masters, because we have a new MSc that's just started here. Put your hands up if you're on the MSc in Neuroscience and Education. Oh, yeah, wonderful people. And then we also have one in London as well. We have one at Harvard. When I say we, not me personally, but Harvard University have one. London University have a course in Neuroscience and Education. There are journals, at least 2, which are dedicated to this field that have arisen in the last 10 years. Psychology has had a poor history, I think, of influencing educational thought. That's a shame, and it shouldn't be the case, but it is the case. And my hope, in a way, is not just that this new interest in neuroscience will bring in ideas about the brain into the classroom, but also because the brain is essentially irrelevant in education, unless it's combined with psychology, it will also bring some psychology into the classroom as well, I hope. But that's something we can think about in a minute. There is no doubt that there is enthusiasm for this. So a survey we did, and this is going back a way now, it's like 2007, showed that teachers, about 90% of teachers, thought that it was important or very important to consider brain function in the design of educational programs. That was a survey of several hundred teachers. And so how far are we, and this is a question that I was asked to address a year or two ago in readiness for this call, how close are we to actually applying neuroscience in the classroom? Well, I used two rather subjective metrics to describe this when I wrote up this review for the Educational Endowment Foundation, and it's still on that website for the Educational Endowment Foundation. You can download it. It only came out, well, within a year, so it's still quite fresh. I looked at the strength of the evidence. So, high evidence would mean we already have multiple classroom interventions. Medium evidence would be when we actually have good evidence from a laboratory, but not many, very few or no studies to actually show it works in the classroom, because those are two separate things. You can actually pick up quite small effects in the laboratory because you can control. But in the classroom, there's much more noise. So are you really worried about improvements that you can't even detect at a classroom level because of all the noise? I think possibly you are actually still, but obviously it's an issue. And if we've got no laboratory intervention evidence at all, then in fact I would have to say that we've got quite low strength of evidence. That doesn't mean that it's not going to work, because we do understand increasing amounts about brain function, and you can hypothesize that something might work. And it might be, that hypothesis might be reasoned on the basis of good evidence from other areas. But of course, what we really want to see is it actually impacting on a type of learning that is useful for education. So maybe people have shown that there's a memory effect for visual images, different types of geometric pattern. Well, that's, if you do a particular thing, like, I don't know, put them through some sort of meditation state or something, and then they remember these geometric patterns much better. That's a typical sort of laboratory experiment that you might do. But remembering geometric patterns is some distance away from curriculum. And therefore, I would say that doesn't really count as intervention evidence that this is going to actually affect results. And then the other thing is distance to application, because it is possible sometimes that things need special software, or they need, if you're going to use neurofeedback, then neurofeedback, whereby you actually monitor your own EEG, that's actually quite expensive. So the idea of a whole class having a systems of neurofeedback for every pupil, that actually makes it quite distant to application, but it's still possible. Other things such as spaced learning is one example, where you just split up your teaching blocks into smaller segments. That could be applied straight away. So that's a very near to application in that sense. And there are some things, of course, which are so distant, because people think, well, this is a really good idea, but I've got no idea what the application would look like. And sometimes I can't think of one offhand, but we'll probably come across one in a minute. Okay, so these are the sorts of areas that I looked at that are possibly applicable in education. We've already looked at this, so this should be familiar to you. We looked at images showing that different parts of the brain activate when we use approximate or exact methods of numerical calculation. And why is that important? Well, it's important because actually these approximate processes are probably what bootstrap. They're the fundamental basis of learning to use exact mathematics. And that's a new idea, actually. We didn't know that the fundamental processes that bootstrap our terribly clever formal mathematics we actually share with guinea pigs and pigeons and other animals. And that makes us think again about the role of simple approximation in very young children when they're learning about maths. And it also is interesting because the areas that are activated appear to be quite close to activations for grasping. So there's a link here between fingers, which have traditionally been thought of as something that you want to reduce the use of. So teachers often looked at mathematical development in terms of children not getting too involved with their fingers, but being able to actually calculate things in an abstract way. Well, the neuroscience is telling us that actually number and fingers, or at least grasping with fingers in the brain, are actually quite closely connected. Yeah.
In the national curriculum in year 3, it states to move on to the next level, you need to reduce children's use of fingers. It's a specific thing that you have to work towards.
Yes. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that,
to move on in maths.
yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, it is very important that we become able to think about these things in an abstract way. I guess it doesn't necessarily mean that you should discourage children from using their fingers. I think it raises a big question mark over it. If this is part of our innate sense of what number is, and it's not a coincidence that we work in base 10, and it's not a coincidence that a lot of errors are made not just between 9 and 10 and 11, but also between 5 and 6. I mean, the numbers 5 and 6. So if you look at where people make mistakes when they're adding and subtracting, and I mean adults, a lot of errors are made between 5 and 6. It's not that they're using their fingers. It's just that the concepts of number are so closely intertwined with our embodied sense of our embodied cognition. And actually, I've hit upon another area there, which is also very interesting. The fact that a lot of how we think about concepts is through our bodies. And it's becoming, increasingly there's an emphasis on thinking about cognition in the brain, not as something which is abstract, but something which does actually very much involve action. So yeah, I think it raises a question, it changes the emphasis in a way, and asks the question, should we be discouraging use of fingers? So there is a study that was done by Gracia and Baffuli, and I don't really know how to pronounce that, where they encouraged children more to use their fingers and to think about their fingers. And they did things like, okay, they sort of close their eyes and then somebody touches a finger and then they open and have to say which finger it was. This is called finger gnosis. Gnosis meaning getting to know. It's like getting to know your fingers. And these children actually experienced improvements in number-related mathematical areas as a result of just getting to know their fingers better. It's very interesting.
Well,
So, yes, hello.
there is someone in this university.
There is somebody in this department who is actually studying this. Who is it? Emma Bent? No. I can't remember who it is, but there is somebody. I keep forgetting that. But you're right, there is somebody actually doing a PhD in this department, and I can't remember, and I'm very ashamed to say I've never spoken to that person about this work, but I should do. So this is, yeah, that is shameful, isn't it? I need to find out who that is. So yes, fingers suggest one type of intervention. Anxiety is another area. Anxiety can be a real barrier to thinking. And when we become anxious, we have less access to our working memory and a whole range of other cognitive functions. And it's particularly a problem with mathematics. And neuroimaging studies are beginning to they're paving the way for a better understanding of this and identifying that simple techniques, such as getting children to express their anxiety about their maths, can actually improve their performance in a maths test. So in this one intervention, they asked children to simply write down what they were anxious about in the test that was coming up. And the maths anxious children actually performed better as a result of that. Interestingly, they didn't ask them to consider what they were going to do about their anxiety or how to deal with their anxiety or anything like that. It was just simply a matter of expressing the anxiety. Appeared to facilitate better maths outcomes amongst the maths anxious children. Mental rotation skills, the ability to say, for example, are these two shapes the same? Now to do that, you have to turn them around in your mind. And some people are better at doing that than others. And that is very closely related. Your ability to do that is very closely related to your mathematical and scientific achievement. And interestingly, mental rotation skills are things which can be improved. And even more interestingly, perhaps, action video games are extremely good at helping you improve your mental rotation skills. What has not yet been shown is that action video games can improve your mathematics. Not because the experiments haven't shown anything, but no one's run the experiments yet. But it suggests things that you might not normally think of. You've already come across some interventions. When we were talking about mathematics, we talked about this study by Anna Kusian and her colleagues in Innsbruck. This was a study where they were encouraging children to think about the physical representation of quantity by not necessarily asking them what the answer was to the sum, but getting a spaceship to land on the answer. And by encouraging that physicality of the number space, they showed that they not only improved their number abilities of children with dyslexia, they also improved the mathematical abilities of children without dyslexia. And they remediated difference in the neural function of the children with number difficulties as well. So you can see it both at the neural and the behavioral level that these children improved. And of course, it raises interesting questions about how we categorize children, what dyscalculia means and those sorts of things. So questions here: can training improve children's non-symbolic representation of number in its relation to symbolic representation? And does this help their mathematics? These are things which haven't been answered, but they look extremely interesting and hopeful. Can video games improve STEM achievement? As I say, we've got no intervention evidence for that, but it's a very reasonable hypothesis. Can understanding of math anxiety improve math achievement? Well, we have got some interventions for that show effects. So when you start looking at these different possibilities for applying neuroscience and education, you can see that some of them have a variety of different strengths of evidence behind them, and some of them vary in how quickly they could actually be applied in the classroom. As far as I'm aware, I don't think any of the 6 projects that have been funded are actually looking at this, but you might be interested in it for your dissertation. Reading. This should be a familiar diagram to you. We talked about different regions of the brain, involved with processing different aspects of language, and the fact that they were highly interconnected. Neuroimaging studies have shown the effects of games such as graphogame on parts of the brain associated with phoneme orthography mapping. But they also, they also suggest, just thinking of the processes, the neural processes of reading as distributed and all very interconnected, they also suggest the importance possibly of multi-component interventions, not just based on grapheme phoneme mapping or orthography phoneme mapping, but also looking at all the other parts of reading, such as spelling patterns, the multiple meanings of words, different parts of speech, different aspects of grammar. And these things, again, can be achieved using computer-based training. So we know that computer-based training focused on phonological skills has helped those experiencing difficulty to develop their reading skills. So, the strength of this is somewhere between medium and high, that it can work. And the distance is quite near because we already have the software. And in fact, this is one of the 6 projects that's being rolled out in the UK now, using a sort of a type of graphogame software. It is the graphogame, but it's some sort of, I think it's some sort of hybrid version of it. And we also know that several multi-component interventions are also successful, and there's a possibility that neuroscience might be able to help identify different areas where learners have difficulty and help us focus on those individual areas of those individuals. So in a sort of diagnostic way, neuroscience may be able to help and have tailored interventions tailored to those particular areas of difficulty. Now, exercise, and we're not talking about brain gym here, but just ordinary aerobic exercise, improves parts of the brain very much to do with paying attention. Remember the anterior cingulate? We came across that in the attention lecture. Very important part of the brain for focusing your attention. We can see that that part of the brain changes its activity favorably after exercise, and it's also active to a different extent depending on how fit you are. This is being applied in schools. So, for example, this is the response time, and you want this to be low because you want people to have short response times. And you can see that this is versus rest. Let's get this right. So this is the control group before and after, and this is the physical exercise group before and after. So you can see that if they've been having 30 minutes of exercise during the day, then their response time, their reaction time, which we think is a measure of executive function, is much faster amongst the exercise group compared with if they were just listening to an audio book. So executive function is really important for learning. It's to do with how we allocate attention. So hardly surprising that the anterior cingulate is one of those areas of the brain that changes as a result of exercise. So can exercise be used to influence academic achievement? Well, this might sound a bit negative at first, maybe it's a bit disappointing, but it really isn't. Almost entirely, exercise interventions have had either no effect or positive effects in almost equal proportion on academic achievement. Now you might think, oh, well, that's a bit disappointing. Why do they work only half the time? But think about this. Actually, that's all different types of exercise interventions, and some will be more aerobic and some will be less aerobic, and some will be for longer or shorter periods of time. And the interesting thing is that all of them tend to involve reducing time spent on curriculum. So actually, the fact that there's no negative effect, it really does indicate that exercise has to be good for learning. So this is actually a very positive result. And the authors that did this large meta review said that there is substantial likelihood of its academic value. And I would go to, I think that's probably putting it very conservatively. I mean, I think it's very clear. People are always looking for things that will improve executive function. We've got brain training games, and we've got sort of meditation and mindfulness and all these sorts of things. But actually, the only thing which has been shown to, well, the thing that's been shown most effective in terms of improving executive function is exercise. And schools tend to think of it as something which keeps you physically fit. It could be good for team building, those sorts of things, or working as a team. They don't tend to think about it in terms of academic value, which is a shame because it's clearly got a very important academic value. And this is one of the interventions that we're now trying in the United Kingdom. So this is being coordinated from Oxford. The most important factors influencing the academic outcomes of research are still a subject of research. Yeah, so we still don't know what aspects it is of exercise that are the most important, but aerobic content is likely to be important. Teenagers, bless them. Teenage lifestyle is a real problem for learning, and the number of teenagers, the number of children that appear to be doing very well at school, and I'm afraid I've got at least one of these, seem to be doing very well at school, and then they reach puberty, and then it's just like, and they start indulging in all sorts of aspects of lifestyle which are really bad for their learning, and they have difficulty sleeping and eating, and certainly have difficulty studying. And part of that is cultural, because they have more freedoms and they're more inclined to say, shut up, I'll do as I want. But part of it is actually biological, in the sense that their circadian rhythms, which is those 24-hour rhythms that make you want to go to sleep or wake up, actually change during puberty. So these are coordinated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in part, and the secretion of melatonin and other control processes changes at that stage in life. And so there really is a reason why teenagers want to sleep in the morning and have trouble going to sleep at night. They're not just being awkward, although I'm sure being awkward is part of it. And But there's also aspects of their lifestyle. Caffeine is heavily implicated in teenagers' loss of sleep. What do you think the other thing is? It's a bit obvious, really, because I've got a bit of a clue there. Sorry? What? Screens, yeah, screens, major problem. So technology and caffeine are, I mean, apart from having friends who phone you up and all the rest of it, are certainly implicated in teenage lifestyle. And it's been, I mean, these things as well, I have to say, you know, these things pack a punch. We would, I mean, if a child is drinking like 2 cans of Coke a day, or no, I shouldn't say Coke, sorry, do beg my pardon, please don't sue me. If they are drinking 2 cans of fizzy drink that are caffeinated, then because it's not just it's Coke. There's loads of them, but that's enough for them to have reduced cognitive function and for them to have withdrawal symptoms afterwards if they stop that habit. They're users essentially. They only have to have less than one of these things. I won't mention the trade name. Okay, these things are so powerful. So if you just have one of those a day, you are definitely going to have reduced cognitive function as a result. And of course, it disrupts sleep as well. There are many questions about this. This is a fascinating study that was done with 13 to 14-year-olds. It's one of my 13 to 14-year-olds down there doing his favourite occupation. I have to say, though, in this study, the experimental conditions in which the children either watched a computer game they either played a computer game or they watched TV, those things happened just for 1 hour between 6 and 7 o'clock at night, which is a very structured, well-organised evening by our standards, I have to say. You know, I mean, I think things are going well if I manage to keep them off technology after 9 o'clock, you know. So we're only talking about 1 hour of technology between 6 and 7. After that hour, the children were asked to do a sort of pseudo homework task where they're given some facts that they had to remember. And then the next day they were tested for the recall of those facts. And it's fascinating because their slow wave sleep, which is the part of sleep that is important for encoding, consolidating what you've learned during the day, was biggest. They had the biggest percentage for the basal condition where there was no technology. They had a considerably reduced amount if they were watching television, and they had the least amount if they were playing computer games. And what's fascinating is that their memory loss for what they actually learned immediately afterwards follows the same pattern. They had least memory loss if they'd been using no technology, much more memory loss if they'd been watching television for an hour beforehand, and then most memory loss if they'd been playing a computer game. So, you know, the type of technology is important. It's not just screens, and I suspect when they use it is important as well. But certainly lifestyle impacts on learning, and sometimes in ways that I'm sure parents have no idea about this sort of study. There's no idea that actually what you do with technology affects how much you learn in the homework that you do after the technology. I mean, you know, that is quite surprising, isn't it? So would teenagers achieve more if they're allowed to sleep later? Well, we are going to find out, yes. Yeah, they have shown, there are adult studies that show there's more disruption of melatonin secretion for small bright screens than for television, for example, and those sorts of things. So they've done more. Yeah, probably would if in terms of getting to sleep afterwards. Yeah. But then maybe you need to be awake while you're reading it. So maybe, you know, these things are very difficult. I mean, I'm getting told off a lot at the moment for being a hypocrite because I'm reading my emails in bed on my mobile before I go to sleep, and this is something I've got to stop. So it's very difficult. It's all very well knowing these facts, and of course this is what we see with teenagers. We give them education programs, and they come out of these education programs with like 100% on the post-test to show they've really learned about lifestyle and the effects of technology and caffeine and late nights on their learning, and they've taken no notice of it whatsoever. You know? So, you know, it's got to be something more than education. We've got to change the culture, if you like. And they have shown some more positive results when they had more in-depth, culturally orientated interventions where, you know, they were sitting down and discussing with teenagers, and they were talking to them sometimes in the evenings, and post-it notes on the fridge and all this sort of thing. So would they, well, we're going to find out, because this is one of the studies that's actually happening. Actually, I'm thinking it's quite good, really, because I gave this very presentation to the Welcome, and I obviously had an impact, because so many of these things they are actually funding, which is really nice. So yeah, all around, I don't know how many schools, there's many schools, there are thousands of children, teenagers, who are going to be allowed to sleep in from now on, and they are going to be examined for their academic progress to see if, in fact, they improve as a result. I can see some of you looking very skeptical, maybe even cynical. I don't know. Yes.
How would you tell? How would you know whether it was the time that they're sleeping actually having, if it doesn't, or the fact that they feel like they've got more control over their life, or they feel like they're happier?
Well, I think that's okay. So I'm being asked, for the sake of the microphone, how would you actually know if it does work, whether it's actually the sleep that's working, and whether they're just appreciating having more control over their lives? Because you don't know they will be sleeping, for one thing. I suppose they'll be asking them, they'll be self-report, and the parents will be reporting whether they think they're sleeping. We don't know about the quality of sleep, though, do we? And actually, you never know when teenagers are sleeping. I don't think they know whether they're sleeping, actually, half the time. There's all sorts of problems with this, and these things are being evaluated using randomized controlled trials. So they're going to take, you know, X thousand children, and half of them will be allowed to sleep in and half of them will not, and they'll be using focused tests, but they'll also be looking at, you know, pre-test, post-test. They'll also be looking at academic results. They'll take into account socioeconomic area and all these sorts of factors. But at the end of the day, if it does or it doesn't work, we won't be completely sure why, I don't think. And that is a problem with RCTs. I don't think RCTs are always the best research tool.
I think my son, if he didn't have to get up and go to school to absolutely hates,
Mm.
he just wouldn't go to bed. And on a Friday night, he doesn't have to get up.
Yeah,
He just won't just,
I'm extremely sympathetic to that idea. That in fact, that, yes, yeah. Yeah, because I know my eldest will just keep sleeping, really. I mean, he just gets into a, you know, just, it's like a flipped day, I suppose. People talk about the flipped classroom. It's like the flipped day. They just live during the night and they sleep all day. I can't believe that that's very good for them. Because I think this is one of the problems, is that we do, yes, it's a difficult time for children, but actually at the end of the day, they do have to learn how to be conventional, don't they? You know, they're going to suffer throughout their lives if they don't learn to get up at least by 8 o'clock in the morning.
There are some kids that want to get up. I know it's better. There's some kids I worked with.
Very
who
varied,
wake up really
yeah.
early just because they,
Yeah, I used to be one of those.
and then they
Weird.
will suffer.
Mm.
Lost.
I know, it's very varied. It's not true for all children, is it? Yes.
Do you have any idea when their rhythms kind of go back to normal, as it were?
Oh,
I mean,
that's a good
what
question.
does that end? 'Cause, you know, you can warn people, you know,
Oh, I don't know.
It's like they go to school later, then they start.
I do not know. I do know. I really don't know the answer to when it ends. I'm sorry about that. When I think there's, I mean, there are discussions about when adolescence ends anyway. I mean, the brain development doesn't really look like an adult's until about 19 quite often. So it could be quite a while. Oh, there's bound to be massive genetic factors that are involved, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are a strong interaction with the environment as well in terms of what the norms are in the household. Yeah. But we'll see. I mean, actually, when I assessed this, I found the strength of evidence pretty low, as you can see, because the studies in America show that children well, okay, there have been like 2 or 3 studies in America, but what they've done, those have involved shifting the beginning of the school day to something like from 7:15 to 8 o'clock. I'm thinking that's incredibly early by our standards. So shifting our day from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock or whatever, it could be a completely different situation. And also what they showed was an improvement in wakefulness. They were less sleepy during the day, but they didn't show an improvement in academic achievement. So I judged it as low, but of course it's very close. It's an easy, well, it's not completely easy, because actually a lot of the parents don't like the teenagers still being in bed when they leave for work. They're a bit suspicious they won't get out of bed at all. Actually, that would be an interesting thing to see if that happens. Simply providing information to teenagers doesn't seem to work, but if you make them more focused in terms of changing culture, it's a little bit more hopeful. We've got genetic markers that are potentially interesting now. I need to move a little bit faster. I'm getting too divergent here, but it's interesting, isn't it? We've got genetic markers, which actually I think are really interesting, not necessarily, because one of the questions is, what are you going to do once you've got a genetic marker in education? So you have a genetic marker and you can say these children are more likely to have problems with dyslexia and these problems are not. These children are less likely. But actually that's really, those sorts of genes are complex in their interaction. So that may be quite some way off, but already we do have some markers that seem to indicate things such as whether you are generally more susceptible to your environment or not. So this is the DRD47 repeat gene, and those people who carry it tend to be educational orchids rather than dandelions. Orchids in the sense that they are very sensitive in both good and bad ways to the environment around them. Whereas if you don't carry it, you're a dandelion, it makes there's much less impact on you. Your school impacts, the quality, for example, of your classroom is going to impact on you much less. The quality of the home environment is going to impact on you much less. And that's a good and a bad thing. It doesn't, but it's an interesting and potentially helpful thing when we're trying to understand the impact of an educational intervention. Because whatever we do with children, if they are dandelions, there's going to be less impact. And maybe we should be worrying, I don't know, this is up for discussion. Should we be worrying more about the orchids? Because at least, we know that it makes more of an effect, more of an impact on them if they're carrying this gene. Yes. Well, no, because it's not according to these studies, because this is a gene. So if they're carrying the gene.
You say before that genes interact with the environment.
Yes, but there are. Yeah, but there are. But I think in this case, well, okay. But what this gene is telling you is the extent to which that is going to be occurring in terms of all the other genes. So which is quite interesting. So the way in which your genetic structure is going to be interacting with the environment generally actually depends on whether you're carrying this gene or not, which is quite fascinating. Embodied cognition. Embodied cognition helps us understand how things work, like the enactment effect. So you ask people to write something, it's better than if you just ask them to read it. But if you actually ask them to act it out in some way, then they're even more likely to remember and understand it. And this is about this close interaction between action and thought. So this is what we call embodied cognition. The fact that our brains are actually designed for action. They're not designed for abstract thought. And therefore, one example of this is if you're a foreign language teacher, you will be able to get your class to remember action verbs better if they are acting them out. Even more interestingly, they are going to remember them more as well if you are acting them out in front of them. And of course, that's probably because of the mirror neurons that activates their motor cortex when you are waving your hands around. So it is important that teachers use gesture. Okay, and knowing these things is helpful. Space learning effect. Rather than us having all our brain, mind and education lectures together, it's much better that we space them out in time. Why is that? Well, we have seen in the spaces activation of a part of the brain, and you might recognize this, it's on the left hemisphere. It's a language area. It's a little bit near Broca's, isn't it? And there's a sense in which that may be indicating unconscious rehearsal of what you've learnt during the learning periods in the spaces. So this is activity you pick up in the spaces related to learning content. So, you know, even though you're not aware of it, if you break up your learning sessions, it's probably going to increase the amount of time that you're rehearsing the concepts, because unconsciously they're going around in your mind in between. This is one of the oldest effects, it's one of the oldest effects ever known. How long do you think it is that we have known that space learning works? 10 years, 20 years? No, over 100 years. Goes back to Ebbinghaus, right? We don't apply it in schools. This is what I mean about the failure of psychology in education. And it's tragic, you know, really. Even in this school, we still have our short, fat modules where you're all placed together for like 3 days in a row, and you're expected to do the whole unit in a couple of days. Yeah. Actually, it's not good practice, because we know it's not good practice because of the way the brain operates. You're much more likely to forget the whole thing. I've probably just really criticised loads of my colleagues now, but there you go. It's something we need to think about. Testing is also really important. We're beginning to understand from neuroscience how testing, rehearsing the encoding and recall of information actually improves your understanding and likelihood of recalling it. We're also understanding about the response to reward and the fact that memory, this is your hang on, what is it actually? Yeah, this is your activation of your nucleus accumbens, and this is the likelihood of you actually remembering it. This is where the nucleus accumbens is here. It's that desire center. Dopamine uptake in that area accelerates the rate at which you're making connections in the cortex elsewhere. And the more that the nucleus accumbens is activated, although it is possible you have that inverted U that we were talking about, but we think that the more that it's activated, the more likelihood there is that you're going to remember something. And that's what we've incorporated in the Zondel team play that you've been playing. And this is another thing that we're rolling out. So we're rolling this one out to schools in the next few years. But it's also been confirmed by the Turks who are using it. A Turkish research group were using the same approach and have validated the principles involved and shown improved motivation, improved not just remembering but depth of understanding as well for concepts when their students were offered uncertain rewards. In other words, not a point, but a chance to win 2 points or no points. Neurofeedback. Essentially, this means monitoring your own EEG signals. And you know, there's loads of, this is an advert from a device. Actually, we've got one. Has anyone played with that yet? I know some of the neuroscience and education people have been playing with it. Have you played with this, John, yet? We haven't got it to work yet. Oh, we've got some connectivity problems. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, we'll have to get that sorted out. But, you know, it's just a little electrode that goes on there, and it's supposed to allow you to monitor your EEG using a single electrode. In fact, I've installed it on here, so it does work on here. I'll show you that later. And you just have this little electrode, and you can watch your brain waves on a mobile phone. It's very cheap, and I don't trust it, to be honest with you. I won't mention the trade name. But these more serious devices certainly do work, and John Griselier at Imperial College has shown, working with the Royal College of Music, that students who monitor their own EEG feedback can improve their degree classification for performance by a whole point. So if they were going to get a 2-2, they get a 2-1 as a result of training themselves using neurofeedback. And he's also just shown that this works for children's creativity in their musical compositions in schools. So that's pretty good. And then, of course, we have stuff like transcranial direct current stimulation. Don't try this at home, but there are lots of self-help sites to show you how to wire up your scalp and pass a small voltage across it. This is being done by, not using that method, but he's using a much more sophisticated method, my friend Roy Cohen-Kadosh. And he's now using this with children who have mathematical difficulties with their maths, and showing that it really does improve mathematical ability. And it's already been shown in trials with military personnel being training for, you know, in these security situations in Iraq. they showed that the military personnel who had this low voltage passed across their scalp when they were in the virtual learning environment learned at almost twice the rate of personnel who did not have that current passed across their head. How does it work? Well, we think it changes the threshold at which neurons fire, is one suggestion. But I have to be honest that I think really the processes are still a little bit unknown, which is why I wouldn't advise you go and try it at home. And there are many other areas where neuroscience and education are coming together. You know, we teach children increasingly on powerful psychoactive drugs. The relationship between memory and stress is becoming better understood. There are times when it is helpful, times when it's not helpful to have stress in terms of learning. Visualization and imitation. When you visualize something or visualize doing something, you activate almost as much of the visual cortex as you do when you actually do it. It's one of those examples of how imagination can be really, really powerful. Working memory training appears to raise your flexible intelligence score, which would be a wonderful thing. So there's a big argument at the moment. There's people like Klingberg in Sweden who are absolutely convinced that this is really working well. And in fact, there are other people like in Innsbruck, I've forgotten the name, Suzanne, I don't know, but there are quite a few research groups who are demonstrating this works well for children and for adults. And working memory is a very important executive function for learning. It's that bottleneck in a way that we have, and so it looks very helpful, but there's also an awful lot of people who are very skeptical and cynical about it. But this area, if you look at the number of papers that are being published, sort of absolutely rocketing exponentially at the moment. Adolescence, we've already spoken about, many more areas where neuroscience appears to be relevant. But the problem is that we're still at a stage where we're beginning to develop these things, and an uncritical excitement, uncritical enthusiasm can lead to a lot of neuromyths. And have I shown you this slide? This shows what happens when you ask experts to rate good and bad explanations. These are the good ones in white, these are the bad ones in grey. And here, they didn't mention neuroscience, but good explanations get a, they're not very enthusiastic, are they? But they get a good, bad explanations get a bad. They put in the irrelevant neuroscience, and it is irrelevant neuroscience, and immediately the experts don't like the good explanation because they sense the bullshit, basically, in the explanation. And the bad explanation is still bad. But this is what happens with the public. They know the difference between a good and a bad, but you put the neuroscience explanation into the bad explanation, and suddenly it's now becoming good. So this is the way in which neuroscience adds that little spicy allure that convinces and sells ideas, and we have to be very careful of that. There's a lot of uncritical confidence in what we know about the brain. And there's all sorts of strange ideas that teachers have. Actually, I won't show you that one. I'll show you this one, which is the more international data that was published last month. So these are just some of the ideas that are popular amongst teachers, and we've measured their popularity in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Turkey, Greece, and also in China. And it's quite interesting to see that some of them, like we only use 10% of our brain, you know, it's incredibly consistent in terms of half of all teachers, wherever they are in the world, believing in that one. This one is also, it's a common sense idea, I suppose, that individuals learn better in their preferred learning style. You know, 9/10 of the world's teachers believe that that is true, and we've got no evidence, no convincing evidence to support that at all. And it's quite often sold on the basis of neuroscience because people feel it must be true. And it's like people pull in neuroscience because they're sure it's true, and the neuroscience will just make it a little bit more credible and explain it a little bit more, because we have visual cortex, auditory cortex, somatosensory cortex. So depending on which bit is bigger, it's probably going to help you mean that you're going to be a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner. This is rubbish, you know. But it's something which is incredibly popular. Coordination exercises, doing lazy eights, as in Brain Gym, can improve integration of left and right brain hemispheres? No, it can't. Hemispheric dominance, whether you're left brain or right brain, is a useful way of categorizing learners. No, it isn't. Children are less attentive after sugary drinks and snacks. Half our teachers thought that was true, but actually it's not. They're more attentive after sugary drinks and snacks. Drinking less than 6 to 8 glasses of water a day can cause the brain to shrink. This is weirdly, this is particularly popular in the UK, possibly where there's been a lot of water advertising, and you get vulvic you get adverts by unnamed water producers who will imply, they don't say it explicitly, but they will imply that drinking this product is going to actually improve your brain function. And also seems to be popular in Turkey for some reason. Learning problems, but these things are a little bit more worrying. In a way, they're more subtle. Learning problems associated with developmental differences in brain function cannot be remediated by education. So once something involves the brain, there's nothing you can do about it. We had a very high rating for that in China. But it may be, and this is one of the problems with these cross-cultural comparisons, it may be that the way in which developmental difference is defined in China, this is my Chinese colleagues who collaborated with me, have discussed this with me, and we're sort of wondering if it's actually how the phrase developmental difference is considered in China. So you have to take these with a little bit of pinch of salt, but it does appear to be very widespread misunderstanding about the brain. Oh, I was messing around with this last night. I'm glad I tested this out now. And I thought it would be fun to put a caterpillar on there. But then I thought that was a ridiculous idea. And I thought I'd taken it off. Certainly should not be in the air. Okay, forgetting the stray caterpillar. This is a slide that I wanted to use to try to explain how these misunderstandings come about. Imagine neuroscience and education as two mountains that have been built, if you like, which do not communicate with each other. There is this cultural gap between them. And it's in this cultural gap that provides the space for neuromyths to form. If it wasn't for this cultural gap, there would be nowhere, there would be no place, there'd be no soil, no fertile soil, no protected area where neuromyths could grow, because if it wasn't for that cultural gap, they would be open to scrutiny. But there is no scrutiny. There's no neuroscientists, there's not enough neuroscientists criticizing strange ideas about the brain that are in education, because they don't really know about them very much. And then when they do see them, they don't recognize them and don't really know what to say about them. And similarly, of course, if we had educators who knew more about neuroscience, then probably, they would be able to scrutinize them as well. So we have to have this cultural gap. We also need some sort of seed. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But as it grows, we also have biases. So what actually comes out of this plant, if you like, this neuromyth, the way it's shaped, the way whether it leans this way or that way, actually is influenced by the biases that live in this cultural gap. Okay, let me explain a little bit more. Let's go back to those seeds, right? What is the seed of a neuromyth? Well, the seed of a neuromyth is quite often a scientific fact. And that's what makes it difficult sometimes when we want to dissipate these things and get rid of them. Learners do benefit from receiving information in a variety of modalities, auditory, visual, and sensory. All learners benefit from that. Unfortunately, it's a myth that learners benefit from being taught in their preferred learning style. It is a fact that language is generally left lateralized, but it's a myth that learners can helpfully be categorized as left or right brained. The fact in terms of water is that dehydration can reduce cognitive function, but it's a myth that in these sorts of climates we need 6 to 8 glasses of water a day to prevent our brain shrinking. But in all of these myths you can find some sort of seed of truth where they started off from. Aerobic exercise is good for the brain, but exercises that rehearse coordination and motor perception skills, they can't improve literacy skills. It's true the younger brain is more plastic, but it doesn't mean that the trajectory of the brain is effectively fixed by 3 years old. That's the myth of 3, and it's very common and it's very dangerous. So that's the seed. What is the cultural gap? The cultural gap is the neuroscience education gap. It's created by the fact that counter evidence is often difficult to access. It's in these highly technical journals, which are not very good at communicating in simple terms. The evidence is often difficult to interpret by non-specialists, and it's potentially confusing, but often very attractive. You see these sorts of images. This is an image that was created from a study of ours a few years ago. And you look at this and you think, you could be really forgiven for thinking that actually the only part of the brain that is active is this part here. That's not the case. This is just the part that has increased its activity beyond some arbitrary threshold that's been set by the experimenter. Actually, all the brain is active, but these sorts of images, you know, they sell the lie that there are different parts of the brain switching on and off. Some ideas that are produced are simply untestable. We haven't got the means in that cultural gap to test them. Multiple intelligences are one of those ideas. How can you test whether a human being's ability can be defined in terms of a limited number of intelligences, especially since we don't know which those intelligences should be, because Howard Gardner and others are still deciding actually what they might be, and they've changed over the years, you know. And no neuroscientist anyway would consider that you could define a human being in that way. You know, no limited number of intelligences can be used to describe human ability. The language is different as well. The word attention means something different in neuroscience to what it does in education. In education, it means eyes front, looking at the board, not talking to your neighbor. In psychology, it means the allocation of mental resources. Learning in neuroscience is about, well, what's it about? Long-term potentiation. In the classroom, we see learning, and educators see learning and the processes of learning as actually social and based on discourse. Motivation as well. Towards education, we're motivated quite often by long-term goals. We want to become doctors, we want to become scientists. Actually, neuroscience and psychology, well, neuroscience anyway, cognitive neuroscience, doesn't deal very well with those sorts of long-term motivations. We really can't study them very well. When we talk about motivation, we talk about the motivation that a mouse has for a piece of cheese. Approach motivation is what we're talking about. Very visceral, very here and now. Very important, mind you, still, because of course that's midbrain dopamine uptake. Very important, particularly for children. But just be aware that these words mean different things. Concepts in neuroscience, there are problems with concepts in neuroscience that don't make them easy to transport. Some of them are just basically complicated, like the mind-brain relationship. It's not straightforward, and we'll look at that a bit more in a minute. Also, some of them are work in progress. We don't know. We're trying to find out about consciousness, but actually, it's, you know, really, I wouldn't like to say that we know anything for sure about consciousness. And some are just simply being ignored. If you really want to frighten a neuroscientist, or you want to find out the depth of their understanding, say, well, what does neuroscience tell us about free will? And they'll just go, nothing, I know nothing, they can't comment. So some are just simply omitted, and that's a very important concept for educators, free will, if we're trying to produce freely willed learners. Okay, so we have the seeds, we have the cultural conditions, this vacuum, which allow these myths to be protected from scrutiny. We also have now what actually is shaping it, and what will determine what comes out is very often these sorts of biases. We have developmental biases that we develop as we grow older. When we're children, we think of the brain and the mind as the same thing. That's called monism. So a 3 or 4 year old will say, I've got, my brain's got, you know, my brain hurts, or my mind hurts, or whatever. If they, you know, they use them interchangeably. But as we get older, we understand that they are we begin to think that they are conceptually separable. That we can actually talk about the mind as if it has nothing to do with the brain, and we can talk about the brain as if it has nothing to do with the mind. It's almost like we go to the other extreme, and we start going down what we would call a dualist route of thinking that these things are absolutely different and they're not connected. The cognitive neuroscientist has a very subtle approach to this. So if you've survived later childhood and you make it to adulthood and you decide you're going to become a cognitive neuroscientist, then your ideas about mind and brain will become a little bit different again. We cognitive neuroscientists tend to think of these concepts as distinct. They are different concepts. One is a theoretical concept, one is a concrete thing. But they are inseparable when it comes to understanding either of them. There is a complex interrelationship between them. So if you have a brain difference, it doesn't make sense to think about that unless you're thinking about the mental contents, how the contents of the mind and the experiences of that person may have influenced that brain difference. So similarly, it doesn't really make sense to be talking about the mind as if it's nothing to do with the brain, you know. The other type of bias, apart from this dualist bias, this non-plastic fixed dualist sort of bias that people develop, is emotional. There are some things we really want to think. We really want to think that there are brain-based teaching methods out there that are prescriptions, like medical prescriptions almost, with the authority of medicine, that we can just put into place and it's going to work. And then there's also an anxiety thing. There are aspects about the brain that we get anxious about. We worry about the shrinking brain. Well, that's a bit scary, isn't it? To think if we don't drink enough water, or our children don't drink enough water, how many mums do you see, you know, clutching the water bottle? Don't forget your water bottle, darling. You know, it becomes a really big issue. The broken brain. You know, the fact that children are taking prescription drugs because they've got a disorder related to brain function, and they are, you know, children think, well, I've got a broken brain. They think of it as quite often as a fixed brain or a limiting factor on their performance. So brains actually, you know, are involved with anxiety as well as wishful thinking. And it's these emotional biases that drive some of the strange ideas we have as well. But the reason why I've really gone down this road, and this is what I want to say tomorrow, this is the bit that I probably wouldn't have put in this lecture, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that actually, no, I think I should do really, because it's important. You guys are going to be specialists, and I don't want you to think that you are going to be immune from the types of problems that have created neuromyths. Okay, so you guys are going to be experts one day, yeah? Well, actually quite soon, I suppose, once you get your masters. People are going to look to you and they're going to ask you questions. You probably might have had this already. You go to parties and people say, oh yeah, actually I'm a bit worried about my brain, or I'm worried about my mind, or whatever, and they'll ask you questions. And don't think that you are because you're experts and you've done all these wonderful essays, that your messages will be immune from these forces. Because you can already see that there are really serious attempts by good neuroscientists to communicate good neuroscience to schools and to teachers, and they are failing quite often because they are subject to exactly the same forces that have produced neuromyths. Neuromyths are not about silly teachers having silly ideas. They're actually about the difficulty in communicating between these two disciplines. This is an example. You know, you see quite often that a dualistic mind-brain model in which the brain cannot be influenced by the mind, because these two things are separate, supposedly, which of course they're not, often surfaces in public discussions. So you see people such as Ruth Hughes, chief executive of the ADHD Association, saying things like, ADHD is a real medical disorder with real brain differences. This is something that she was saying in Newsweek. What do we mean by, well, the implication is here, because there are brain differences, and there are real brain differences, then it must be a real disorder. Okay, because there's this idea that if it's in the brain, it's medical and it's more serious. And behind this is the idea that it's more serious, therefore, because it must be fixed, you know, and therefore we have to take it more seriously. And as I've said before, if you separated people into good and bad table manners, you would see brain differences, I'm sure, between those two groups. But it doesn't mean that necessarily that bad table manners is a developmental disorder. And yet, weirdly, you see exactly the same mistake, thinking about the brain as something which is biologically, you know, fixed, in the counter arguments. And you see arguments because if you think about it, if all true disorders are biologically determined, in other words, they're about separable real brain differences, nothing to do with the mind, but these are fixed brain differences, then they should be immune to educational interventions. Interventions, whether it's or the home environment, shouldn't have any effect upon them. And therefore, when we see that in fact there are environmental effects, that there are educational interventions not very dissimilar to those for people who are not diagnosed with disorders that appear to influence the outcomes, then we get these sorts of headlines saying the great ADHD myth, dyslexia, a big expensive myth. So, you know, we see exactly the same problems in communicating real neuroscientific ideas or issues involved with neuroscience, good neuroscience, arising when experts try to communicate the messages as well. We also, in another area, and I could show you lots of examples of this, the teenage brain is often described scientifically in terms of the dual systems framework. The dual systems framework is this idea that you have a reward system which is almost fully developed during adolescence, but you have frontal and parietal lobes that might inhibit your behavior, that might think about things at a higher level, which are not fully developed. And if we think about decision making as a sort of a conflict between those two areas, then simply because the frontal lobes and parietal lobes are not fully developed, you could say, and it has been said, that teenagers are all gas and no brakes. Yeah, so in other words, they're just led on by rewards and they've got no frontal lobe or parietal lobe function which is mature enough to be able to stop them from doing things. This is not a bad approximation to the dual systems framework, actually. I mean, this is the sort of idea, I suppose. It's not a bad metaphor for explaining how the dual systems framework operates, but it is an unfortunate metaphor when you think about its educational implications, because, you know, if teenagers are completely detached from their own free will and immune to the normative social influences around them, which is what this seems to be suggesting, if they're all gas and no brakes, they can't stop themselves. Now, you can't stop yourself if you haven't got any brakes, can you? What does it say about how a teacher, for example, should respond to a teenager who's disruptive? Perhaps they shouldn't blame them, you know, because it's not their fault. And actually how they can respond to them, because what can they do anyway if the teenager can't stop their behavior? So it really influences, I'm sure it does really influence teachers' ideas, having these sorts of boiled down messages about the brain. So experts try to simplify ideas about the brain, and when they do, there can be real problems with that. Why are the problems? Because these boiled down messages are subject to exactly the same cultural gap and biases that have created neuromyths. So neuromyths, as I say, it's not just about it's not about at all silly teachers having silly ideas. It is actually about the problems that we have in communicating between these two fields. So what do we need apart from a curly grasshopper? Well, we need collaboration, because we have to have messages developed together, ideas and concepts that are developed together that have scientific validity. Yes, neuroscience can help us with that, but they also have to have educational meaning. And the meaning that we attach to these ideas has to be developed with educators. Otherwise, we're going to get more confusions, essentially. Any questions about that? Yes.
Well, do you think that collaboration is the only thing we need to close that gap? Because obviously that education is quite a top-down sort of system with government telling education what they need to do, and then you've also got the media as well.
No, I mean, yes, it's not just. I think it's the biggest thing that I'm worried about, I suppose. But we have to be very careful with media messages. We need government support. They need to be collaborating on what, we need to be collaborating on research projects and developing ideas. I think that's the only way that it's going to operate, because we're developing this field. So what we don't want is to develop the field without teachers being involved. That's going to end sort of disastrously, I think. So yeah, it's not simply collaboration, but it's something that we're in danger of very quickly losing if we're not careful. Because we have, for example, in the United States, I think you can see that quite often they have these big conferences and they pay neuroscientists to come in and they deliver their baubles of their silver baubles of wisdom pearl, the pearls of wisdom, and actually they're not, the messages are not fit for the classroom. They're not fit for the classroom because they haven't been developed with classroom practitioners.
I'm also looking at the thing that people think it's something science, that it's true, whereas
Yeah, the allure of neuroscience. Yeah, absolutely. So there are also ethical issues in this area. We have ethical issues about cognitive enhancement. We have neuroscientists who say, let's go and explore the new enhancement landscape. Government should just keep out of it. On the other hand, we've got educators saying, no, actually, an exam achieved with a smart pill is not quite the same as an exam result achieved without a smart pill. We also have other types of enhancement, which I've already mentioned, such as the transcranial electric stimulation. We have the possibility of infant screening at for dyslexia at birth. So we have neural and genetic markers that may be able to indicate children who are at risk. Is that more labeling? Do the social dangers outweigh the educational benefits? Genetic profiling as well. And actually, collaborative research is not completely straightforward. We surveyed teachers, head teachers, trainee teachers, and teachers who are in post. And 20% of them thought that we should not be using any research that was derived from animal experiments. So there's like a big difference between the types of educational research that have gone on in the past and the types of educational research that are possible in the future. And I would say that we need to think very carefully about the types of ethics that we're going to be applying in this new field as well. They will retain some character from neuroscience in terms of scientific and physical health issues, but they also need to incorporate some of the social value issues that we are good at talking about and discussing in education. Okay, this was the book I recommended. You can find out more about neuroscience and education if you go for that book. It's in its second print run, I'm pleased to say. It's available in Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. Oh, no, it's not available in Chinese yet, but it should be, sorry. Okay, so, I mean, what I'm suggesting as a way forward in this area is that we need different types of studies to actually contribute to our understanding. Scientific studies, in terms of answering questions that are of importance to education, but using scientific techniques like neuroimaging. Bridging studies that actually look at the realities in the classroom and find out the answer to questions that can't be answered in a laboratory, such as the way that the new technique or intervention is being talked about, the way in which it affects the learning discourse in the classroom. And we need practice-based studies to actually develop the best possible practice using these techniques, which all of these have to include teachers. In terms of identifying questions, collaborating on bridging studies, and actually telling us what is working. So a whole variety of different methods actually could be employed, interacting with each other, bringing together biological, experiential, and social evidence. This is a different, experimental, interpretive, and reflective types of studies, producing or supporting two goals, not just understanding and producing better education, but also actually furthering scientific understanding about what happens in the mind and the brain in these more complex real-world contexts. Okay, so if you want to know more about that sort of thing, you might want to come along to Issues in Neuroscience and Education, but I don't really want to advertise that too much because we've already got too many students on that. It seems to be much more popular this year than ever before. Okay, so are there any questions about neuroscience and education? This is a good time if there are things that you've heard about or questions that you have to ask about what neuroscience has to do with what you've seen in schools. This is a good time to ask. Yes.
I have a question, but it's just an observation really. I've got two, they're now teenagers and they give up, but they're both got dyslexia and with education, that's what they and dyscalculia. And I sometimes think it was quite a hard fight to get any help with that from schools. In fact, you know, my son, quite a long time, was just labelled as basically.
Just to remind you, actually, that this is being broadcast, I just should have said that. Okay.
But you know, he was labelled anyway.
Yeah.
And a little bit of me thinks that if someone could have just brain scanned him as a baby and said, these are the potential problems, I could have prepared for that. My daughter who's younger, because I kind of had already been through it all with him, it was great because she got everything she needed because I knew exactly what I was doing, who I was asking, who I was shouting at, who I was fighting, and she got everything she needed and is therefore actually better off than he is now. She is at school. He went through a lot of time I didn't know what I was doing. I just, you know, believed what the teachers told me, or what they didn't know. It was just, it would have been very helpful if someone could have said from a very early age, actually, do you know what, he's just textbook dyslexia, and just help with it. And we could try these interventions. If they don't work, you can try something else, but not just always lazy, disruptive. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the only danger with this, though, is that, of course, you can never be 100% sure, and they're very far from 100% sure, I think, at the moment. So you can predict, you can say that, okay, these children are at risk, but maybe 7 out of 10 of them will develop dyslexia or dyscalculia, but 3 out of 10 might not. So you have to think about those children as well. But having said that, the interventions for dyslexia and dyscalculia help children, all children. So it doesn't seem to be particularly, but I can see why. I mean, can anybody see why there is a bit of a concern about very early screening?
I mean, if I hadn't gone through that experience, I would be
Yeah.
saying that, but it's just that he got labelled anyway.
Yeah.
With some very unpleasant labels, and he went, when I took him out and sent him to a specialist dyslexic school, he went from 2 years behind to 2 years ahead.
So in that case, it might have been helpful to have known right from birth that this child might need some extra support. Yeah, I mean, I can really sympathise. I mean, Usha Goswami, for example, seems to be very supportive of this. So she's been quite responsible for drawing attention to the benefits of infant screening. And I hope I'm not speaking for her, but I think she would say that this is a really good idea, and we should be thinking about this much more now. Now it's possible because it's not very invasive. It just involves EEG, hairnet, and this sort of thing. Yeah.
My 2 children.
Yeah.
One I had, the younger one, I thought, right, I noticed what that possibility. Let's get on and start dealing with it at an earlier stage. I wish I'd had that with him.
And I think parents are going to start doing this anyway. I think if it's available privately, I think a lot of parents are going to be doing this, not just in terms of neural signals, but in terms of genetics as well, because I think some of the cognitive things like reading and mathematics, actually, because they have a variety of candidate genes involved and there's a complex interaction between them, and the same genes appear to be responsible for ability and difficulties, I think it's going to be longer than people think before we get to a point that we can actually do a genetic test at birth for risk. But there are already as candidate single gene markers, as I've suggested there, that actually some parents would like to know about. I think I'd like to know whether my children were dandelions or orchids. And if you're just checking for one marker like that, it can be just like £5 or £10. So it seems to me that parents are going to be doing this privately anyway, which means that then education is going to have to catch up again, which it usually has to do, actually. And you're going to have a parent in the corridor saying, look, here's my genetic test, or here's my brain scan, or whatever. What are you going to do about it? You know.
That's what I did. Well, here's the EdSite report.
Yes. Yeah.
Deal with it.
So it seems like it's on the cards one way or the other. Molly?
I completely get all that. I just think for those kind of 3 out of 10 who have the children that are labelled.
Yeah, it's problematic. It is.
They've been given a label,
Yeah.
and that's in their head that could affect their, I don't want to say that would happen, but they're kind of trying, I'm dyslexic.
Yeah, because one of the problems is that you're drawing attention to some biological indicators in a world where biological indicators are so easily misunderstood as indicating some sort of fixedness. So all these problems are sort of interconnected, because on the one hand, I think you're right. I think early indicators would be, really does make sense, because the earliest possible intervention is probably going to be more effective than a later one. Yeah, yeah, it all makes sense. The trouble is, it's in a world that doesn't make sense, and in that world which is still sort of struggling with what a disorder or what a difficulty with reading and maths actually is there a possibility that there will be more prejudice or misunderstanding? I don't know. I mean, I think I can sort of see we have to move forward on all these fronts at once, don't we, in a way? Yes.
Is there evidence that later intervention doesn't work? Because if we're saying that intervention will still work even when you're older, I mean, I'm dyslexic and I wouldn't like to have been labelled at a younger age, because I think that would have impacted, because the understanding of schools and the understanding of parents impacted the learning opportunities I'd have had when I was younger. That makes sense.
The brain is more plastic when you're younger. So in a very general way, earlier interventions are more often more effective than later interventions. But there is a danger with that idea, because actually there are other parts of the brain that develop later on. You know, so analyses that have been done by Heckman indicate that cognitive skills are better invested in when you're young, but when you're investing in older children, like teenagers, you're better investing in what is called non-cognitive mental skills. To a psychologist, that is impossible. You can't have a non-cognitive mental ability. But what they are actually referring to are things like personality traits or motivation, or those sorts of skills, leadership, organizational sort of skills. And some of those are linked in with identity, where there's a lot of psychological evidence that does develop very strongly during adolescence. So we mustn't get too hooked up on the idea that earlier is always better. But actually, in reading and mathematics, there is certainly evidence to suggest that the earlier interventions can be more effective. I think particularly where development, and I get worried about using the word abnormal, but where development appears to be different. And I think there's a big question about how different dyslexic development is, because it's a language in that way is a cultural invention. So up until 2,000 years ago, nobody would have known if you got dyslexia. Because only in the last 2,000 years, which is a fraction of a time over which we cannot have evolved, in that sense, that really this has become an issue. So, to what extent is dyslexia abnormal development? Very, very difficult to say, really. But certainly in areas where we can be sure that things are more abnormal, such as autism, earlier interventions appear to be more effective, and there's a good case for thinking in terms of the neuroscience that they may be more effective as well. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your personal view on smart pills, and what's the university standpoint as well?
Well, I think my personal view on smart pills. Yeah, no one's ever asked me that before. I don't take them myself. I have friends who do. I have academic colleagues. So I feel sometimes under personal pressure. I'm sure my career would go on in leaps and bounds if I started taking them, which is interesting, because I think this is going to be more about office pressure than club pressure, if you like, because they're not so much regarded as leisure pills, more like a professional sort of support. I don't know. I don't particularly want to think or work harder at the moment. I think if I was younger, I would probably feel more tempted. But I suppose I still tend to feel that nature has a zero-sum approach. And if you're gaining in one area, you might be losing out in another. And there are questions that are unanswered I mean, to what extent is a sudden improvement in your mental ability going to mean a change in your personality and who you actually are? I mean, nobody really has answered that question. There are some side effects to some of these pills, like donepezil, for example. Headaches and nausea, commonly experienced. Drugs like modafinil that are taken to reduce the amount of sleep you need and to enhance cognition. Very popular drug amongst some areas of academia. I don't understand how that can not have side effects, because sleep is really important for consolidating memory. But the real problem is that these drugs have not been tested out over extended periods amongst the healthy population. They're being used in that way, but they're not being tested because you can't get a license to test them in that way. A lot of them have been developed for Alzheimer's or for people who have health problems, and they've been tested in that context. So the question is still unclear, really, as to what the outcomes would be. What's your opinion? Yes or no?
Well, I think 20 years ago, the idea of taking a multivitamin tablet would probably have been seen as incredibly strange. So I think potentially in 20 years' time, the idea of somebody taking a cognitive enhancement drug prior to assessment, I think is seen as relatively standard in the sense of practice. I mean, the idea before kind of getting a good night's sleep and a glass of water before your big day. I mean, I think as we progress kind of as a society, we're going to kind of take things into our own hands a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the common neuroscientist approach to smart pills. I can see other people going, no. It's a tricky one. I don't think there's a clear argument about this. This is all about the extent to which humanity wants to take its own biological destiny in its hands. And this is one of many questions that we're being, challenges that we've got ahead, really. But I think what worries me is that it's not being discussed in education. And you've asked me, what's the university policy? And as far as I know, there is no policy. There is no policy. The educators don't want to face up to this, really, at the moment. But it is going to become a problem. And I think, interestingly, the transcranial electric stimulation may be the thing that causes us to think more clearly about it, because that's so more easily available, and they are selling them and they're legal. And I'm not suggesting anybody uses them, but, they're freely available. So what do we feel about that? Because that's the same issue, really. Sorry, a lady had her hand up there.
I'm just thinking about the, people saying at the moment there's not really so much research done into it. Has anybody experienced what it's like when they stop taking them? Are there, potential come-down effects or?
Not that I know of. I mean, no, not that I know of, because I think anything you've encoded, as a result of taking donepezil, presumably is still better. It's more firmly stored in your brain and consolidated.
It must be more. Once you've had it, you must be thinking, well, I should carry on.
Well, that's right. It can become a habit. I mean, it can become part of your confidence. So you think, well, I've done well the last couple of years, what would happen if I stopped taking them? So it's an interesting question. Yes. Well, caffeine, of course, but caffeine actually suppresses your cognitive function after a while, so I wouldn't really recommend that. I think you can take nicotine pills are illegal, aren't they? I don't know. Nicotine is a cognitive enhancer, but yeah, that's right. Yeah, so nicotine's been shown to enhance cognition, but I wouldn't bother with them, really. I think at the moment I would just keep to a healthy diet and exercise. Exercise is really good for your cognition. So probably they don't help you that much more than a run around the park. I don't know, actually, though. I don't know. Yes. Yeah, because they'll be getting a license for them for use, with Alzheimer's and other areas. There tends to be the people that produce them do a lot of the research. But there's also academic independent research on them as well. What would be a wonderful dissertation, though, would be if somebody actually does do a survey of students and finds out if these things are being used. They've done these studies in Italy and in America, and they've shown that, you know, there are significant numbers of students who are using them. I don't know any students who use them, but that's probably because they don't tell me. I know a few academics. But anyway, okay, so are we all good? So I'm going to get a list to you of groups for next week, and I mean, keep those 2 periods free at the moment if you can. But it may be that you don't have to come in for all or one of them. Yeah, not for all. You have to come in for one of them. But
So
okay.
this afternoon, is it a repeat of last Wednesday's? Was there a workshop?
There's no workshop for no. We're back to no. There's no workshop for psychology. Yeah, but is there? I haven't been advertising that, have I hope. No, there's no more of those little workshops now, except for neuroscience and education people. You've got them. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know if it's actually starting?